The first thing Lieutenant Mara Vance felt was pain shooting through her skull like fire. And the second thing she noticed was the smell of smoke mixed with something strange and wet, an alien that filled her nose and made her want to gag. She opened her eyes slowly and saw nothing but twisted metal and sparking wires hanging above her face. And beyond that, she could see a sky that was the wrong color, a deep purple that no human had ever been born under. And she knew in that moment that everything had gone terribly wrong. The ship was gone. Not gone in the sense that it had left her behind, but gone in the sense that it had become 1,000 pieces of broken dreams scattered across a valley she did not recognize. And as she pulled herself out from under a collapsed support beam, she could see the full horror of what had happened to the Meridian's hope. Bodies lay among the wreckage, her crewmates, her friends, people she had eaten breakfast with just hours ago when they had been traveling through safe space on a simple survey mission. And now they were still and silent and would never speak again. Mara wanted to scream, but something inside her told her to stay quiet. Some ancient instinct that her ancestors had carried through 200,000 years of survival. And so she bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, and she forced herself to think instead of cry. Where was she? She crawled toward the nearest intact console and wiped the blood and dirt from the cracked screen. And when the emergency display flickered to life, her heart sank into her stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. That's her IV. She knew that name. Every spacer knew that name, because it appeared in the Galactic Union database with a warning that made even veteran explorers turn their ships around and find another path. The warning was simple and terrible. Apex predator saturation unsurvivable. Do not land under any circumstances. 3 alien species had tried to colonize this world in the past 500 years, and 3 alien species had been completely wiped out. Not by disease or hostile plants or bad weather, but by the things that hunted in the forests and the valleys and the mountains of this cursed planet. The Vathkai. Mara had seen pictures of them in xenobiology class back when she was training at the academy, and she remembered how her instructor had spoken about them with something close to fear in his voice, which was strange because her instructor was a 7-foot Valorni warrior who had fought in 3 wars and had never shown fear of anything. The Vethkai were pack hunters the size of earth tigers, but built more like wolves, with 6 legs that could carry them faster than any ground vehicle, and heads that split open into 4 sections filled with teeth that could bite through steel. They hunted through fear. Their bodies produced chemicals that they spread across their territory, and these chemicals triggered something in the brains of their prey that made the prey freeze in place and wait to die. And this had worked on every species that had ever encountered them. Mara looked up at the purple sky and saw that the twin suns of this system were moving toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if they did not mean that night was coming. She had to move. She searched the wreckage with desperate hands, pulling open containers and digging through debris. And she gathered everything she thought she might need. A plasma cutter that still had some charge left. Emergency food packets that would keep her alive for maybe 2 weeks. A water recycler that seemed mostly undamaged. A handful of flares that burned bright white. And the ship's backup I-core that was cracked but still functioning at maybe 30% capacity. She also found a knife. A good knife with a blade as long as her forearm, and she strapped it to her belt even though she knew it would do nothing against creatures that had evolved to kill things, much larger and stronger than any human. The suns touched the horizon and Mara felt the temperature begin to drop, and with the fading light came sounds from the forest that surrounded the valley, sounds that she had never heard before and hoped she would never hear again. Clicking. It was a clicking sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like 1,000 insects rubbing their legs together, but deeper and more deliberate and filled with a hunger that made her skin crawl. Then came the roars, low and guttural and powerful enough that she felt them vibrate through her chest. And she knew that the Vethkai had found the crash site, and they could smell the death, and they were coming to investigate. Mara ran. She did not think about where she was going. She just ran toward the largest piece of wreckage she could see. A cargo pod that had somehow survived the crash mostly intact. And she threw herself inside and slammed the emergency seal behind her. The pod was dark and cramped and smelled like machine oil and fear, but it was solid. And when she heard the first scraping sounds against the outer hull, she thanked whatever gods might be listening that she had made it inside in time. They were right outside. She could hear them moving around the pod, sniffing at the seams, testing the metal with their claws. And she could hear that terrible clicking sound so close now that it seemed to be inside her own skull. Mara pressed her back against the far wall and held her knife in front of her with both hands, knowing it was useless. Knowing that if they got inside, she would die just like everyone else who had ever faced these creatures. But she did not cry, and she did not scream, and she did not freeze. Something inside her refused to give up. Some stubborn spark that had kept her species alive through ice ages and famines and wars and plagues. And that spark whispered to her in a voice that sounded like all of her ancestors speaking at once. "You are not prey." The night lasted forever, or at least it felt that way, and Mara did not sleep for even 1 second as she listened to the creatures outside circle and scratch and growl with frustration. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the cracks in the pod's hull and the sounds outside faded away as the Vethkai retreated from the rising suns, Mara finally allowed herself to breathe. She was alive, but she knew that this was only the beginning. And she knew that the creatures would return when darkness fell again. And she knew that they were smart enough to eventually figure out how to get inside her tiny metal shelter. She had maybe 3 days before they found a way in. 3 days to do something that no one had ever done on this world. 3 days to survive. Mara looked at the supplies she had gathered, and she looked at the cracked eye core, and she looked at the knife in her shaking hands. And she made a decision that would change everything. She was not going to hide and wait to die. She was going to fight back. She was human, and humans did not accept death quietly. They never had, and they never would. When the twin suns climbed high enough to fill the valley with golden light, Mara forced herself to open the cargo pod door and step outside into a world that wanted her dead. The evidence of the night was everywhere around her. Deep scratches covered the outside of the pod where the Vethkai had tried to tear through the metal, and the ground was covered with tracks that showed 6-toed feet and claws longer than her fingers. She counted at least 40 different sets of prints. 40 of those monsters had circled her shelter all through the night, trying to find a way to reach the soft human meat inside, and they would return when darkness fell again. But they were gone now, driven back to whatever caves or shadows they used to hide from the light. And Mara knew she had to use every moment of daylight she had. She connected the damaged AI core to her personal communicator and waited while the machine struggled to wake up, its cracked housing flickering with unstable light. Finally, the familiar voice of the ship's computer spoke, weak and glitchy, but still working. "Systems operating at 24% capacity," the AI reported. "How may I assist you, Lieutenant?" Mara asked it to tell her everything about the Vethkai. She wanted every piece of information in the Galactic Union database, every report from every failed colony, every scientific study that had ever been done on these creatures. The AI worked for nearly an hour, sorting through data that would have taken Mara weeks to read on her own. And when it finally gave her its report, she sat very still and listened to every single word. The Vethkai had ruled Desert for more than 50 million years. Nothing on this planet had challenged them because they were the perfect hunters, designed by evolution to kill anything that moved. They were fast enough to catch the quickest prey. They were strong enough to tear through almost any defense. They were smart enough to learn and adapt and work together in packs that numbered in the hundreds. But their greatest weapon was not their speed or strength or intelligence. Their greatest weapon was fear. The AI explained that the Vethkai produced chemicals in their bodies that they spread across their territory through scent glands in their feet. And these chemicals affected the brains of other creatures in a very specific way. When prey animals smelled these chemicals, something in their minds broke. They would freeze in place, unable to move, unable to run, unable to do anything except stand there and wait to be eaten. This had worked on every species that had ever evolved on Lesser IV. This had worked on the Voloni soldiers, who had come with weapons and armor. This had worked on the Kreth scientists, who had come with plans and technology. This had worked on the Morvani colonists, who had come with poison and determination. Every single one of them had eventually frozen when the fear became too great. And every single one of them had died with the taste of alien chemicals in their lungs. Mara thought about this for a long time. The Vethkai had never faced anything that did not respond to their fear chemicals. They had never hunted prey that could resist the paralysis. They had spent 50 million years becoming masters of terror, and they had never needed to develop any other way of hunting. But Mara was not from this IV. Her brain had not evolved alongside these chemicals. She could smell them, a faint bitter scent that made her feel slightly dizzy if she breathed too deeply, but they did not freeze her in place the way they were supposed to. The Vethkai had never faced a human before, and humans were different from every other intelligent species in the galaxy. The AI explained this to her in simple terms that made Mara understand her own species in a way she never had before. Most aliens had evolved as specialists, becoming the very best at one specific thing. The Valarni were strong, bred for war and combat. The Kreth were clever, designed for thinking and planning. The Morvani were patient, built for waiting and enduring. Each of these species had survived on their home worlds by being better than everything else at their one special skill. But humans had evolved as generalists. Humans were not the fastest runners, or the strongest fighters, or the most patient hunters, but they were good enough at everything to survive in almost any situation. And more importantly, humans had learned to adapt faster than any other known species. When humans faced a problem, they did not keep doing what their ancestors had always done. They invented something new. They made tools. And there was one tool that humans had created so long ago that it had become part of their very souls. One tool that no other intelligent species had ever developed on their own. Fire. Mara looked at the plasma cutter in her hands and she felt something warm bloom in her chest. She spent the rest of the day exploring the crash site and the edges of the forest, always moving quickly and always watching for signs of danger. She discovered that the trees on this planet produced a thick black sap that smelled terrible. And when she touched a spark from the plasma cutter to a glob of this sap, it burst into flames that burned hot and bright and lasted for a long time. She gathered as much of the sap as she could carry. She found metal poles in the wreckage and wrapped their ends in cloth soaked with the black substance. She made torches, not one or two, but dozens of them, enough to light up the entire night if she needed to. When the suns began to sink toward the mountains and the shadows started to grow long, Mara did not run back to the cargo pod and hide. Instead, she stood at the edge of the clearing with a burning torch held high above her head, and she waited. The clicking started first, rising from the forest like a warning. Then she saw the eyes. Dozens of glowing eyes stared at her from the shadows between the trees, reflecting the light of her torch, watching her with an intelligence that made her stomach clench with fear. But Mara did not freeze. She walked toward them. The Vethkai did not move at first, and she could see confusion in the way they shifted and looked at each other. Nothing on this world had ever walked toward them. Nothing had ever moved closer instead of running away. Mara thrust the torch forward, and the flames crackled and danced and threw wild shadows across the ground. The Vethkai stepped backward. Just a few steps, just a small retreat, but it was enough to tell Mara everything she needed to know. Fire was alien to them. Nothing on this planet had ever created fire, because nothing had ever evolved the intelligence to do so. And the Vethkai had no instinct for how to deal with something that burned and hurt their eyes that were designed for darkness. For the first time in 50 million years, the apex predators of HFY had encountered something they did not understand. And Mara understood, in that moment, that things which could be confused were things which could be beaten. She walked back to her camp with the torch burning bright, and she could hear the Vethkai following in the darkness behind her. But they did not attack. They were uncertain. And uncertainty, Mara knew, was the first crack in the wall of their dominance. She was going to make that crack bigger. She was going to teach these monsters something they had never learned in all their millions of years. She was going to teach them that humans were not prey. The days that followed were filled with more work than Mara had ever done in her entire life. Hard, brutal work that left her muscles screaming and her hands covered in blisters. But she did not stop, because stopping meant dying. She started with fire pits, using the plasma cutter to slice through the rocky ground. She dug deep holes in a wide circle around the clearing where the ship had crashed, and she filled each hole with the black tree sap and dry wood and anything else she could find that would burn. When night came and she lit the ring of fire pits, the entire clearing was surrounded by a wall of flames that pushed back the darkness and made the shadows retreat. The Vethkai came as they always did, their clicking calls rising from the forest like a horrible song. But when they saw the ring of fire, they stopped at the edge of the light and would not come closer. Mara watched them watching her, dozens of glowing eyes filled with confusion and what she hoped was the beginning of fear. But fire alone was not enough. These creatures were smart, smarter than any animal that had ever lived on Earth. And she knew they would eventually figure out that flames could not chase them and could not hurt them if they were fast enough. She needed more defenses. The second week she spent building walls. She dragged pieces of the ship's hull across the ground, using a makeshift sled she had built from cargo straps and metal poles. And she welded the pieces together with the plasma cutter until she had barriers that stood taller than her head. The walls were not meant to stop the Vethkai because she knew nothing could truly stop them if they attacked with all their strength. The walls were meant to break their line of sight. The AI had explained that these creatures hunted through intimidation, using their numbers and their terrible appearance to freeze prey with fear before they ever got close enough to bite. If the Vethkai could not see her, they could not intimidate her. And if they could not intimidate her, they would not know what to do. By the end of the second week, her camp had transformed from a desperate shelter into something that almost looked like a fortress, with walls and fire pits and a small covered area where she could sleep without rain falling on her face. But her greatest weapon came from an unexpected discovery in the third week. Mara was searching through the wreckage for more building materials when she found a metal box that had somehow survived the crash without a scratch. Inside was the ship's entertainment system, a collection of music and videos and games that the crew had used during the long, boring stretches between planets. When she connected it to her communicator and turned it on, the sound that came out made her laugh for the first time since she had arrived on this terrible world. Music. Drums and guitars and voices singing words and languages she had almost forgotten. And in that moment, Mara remembered something important that the AI had mentioned in its report. Humans were the only intelligent species in the known galaxy that created music. Other species enjoyed pleasant sounds, and some of them had discovered patterns that were nice to listen to. But no other civilization had ever developed the complex, organized noise that humans called music. The rhythms and melodies and harmonies that could make a person feel emotions so powerful they brought tears to their eyes. The Vethkai communicated through low sounds, growls and rumbles that traveled through the ground and told other pack members where to go and what to do. They used sound as a language. What would they think of music? That night, Mara connected the entertainment system to the external speakers that had been designed to make announcements to crew members outside the ship, and she turned the volume up as high as it could possibly go. Drums exploded through the clearing like thunder rolling down from the mountains. Bass notes shook the ground beneath her feet until she could feel them in her bones. Guitars screamed and voices roared, and the night was filled with sound unlike anything this planet had ever heard in all its billions of years of existence. The effect on the Vethkai was immediate and dramatic. Mara could see them at the edge of the firelight, dozens of massive predators that had killed thousands of colonists, and they were acting in ways she had never seen before. They twitched and jerked and stumbled into each other. They turned in circles like they were trying to find the source of the noise. They made sounds she had never heard them make before, high-pitched whines that sounded almost like distress calls. The music was breaking their minds. Their brains were designed to interpret sounds as communication, and the music was full of patterns that almost sounded like meaning, but never quite made sense. They could not tell if they were hearing one creature or 100. They could not tell if the sounds were threats or warnings or something else entirely. They could not tell anything at all. The pack that had been circling her camp every night, the same pack that had killed her crewmates and destroyed her ship, turned and ran back into the forest like frightened animals. Mar stood in the middle of her camp with the fire burning around her and the music blasting from the speakers, and she raised her fists to the sky and she screamed. Not a scream of fear, but a scream of victory. She had done it. She had found a way to fight back against creatures that had never been fought before. The weeks that followed were a blur of work and improvement and careful observation. She expanded the ring of fire pits until they covered a larger area. She built more walls and better walls. She experimented with different kinds of music to see which ones confused the Vethkai the most. And every night she watched the predators from behind her defenses, and every night they stayed a little bit further away. By the 6th week, they would not come within 200 meters of her camp. By the 8th week, she could barely see their eyes glowing in the distant darkness. Mara had done something that no one else had ever done on Desert IV. She had claimed territory. The apex predators of this death world, the monsters that had ruled for 50 million years, had decided that one small clearing in one small valley was not worth the trouble of trying to take. They did not understand what lived there. They did not know if it was one creature or many. They only knew that it made fire and noise and refused to act like prey. And for hunters that depended on understanding their prey, that mystery was enough to make them stay away. One morning, Mara woke up and realized that she was not just surviving anymore. She was living. She had food and water and shelter and safety. And she even had a small garden growing in soil she had tested to make sure it would not poison her. She stood at the edge of her camp as the suns rose, and she looked out at the forest where she knew the Vethkai were hiding. Somewhere out there, the greatest predators in the galaxy were learning a lesson that no one had ever taught them before. They were learning to be afraid. And they were learning it from a single human with nothing but fire and noise and the stubborn refusal to die. The Galactic Union patrol ship detected the distress beacon on a routine sweep of the outer sectors. And when the navigation officer checked the coordinates of the signal, he was certain there had been some kind of mistake. No one could be alive on Desert IV. That planet appeared on every star chart in the Union with the biggest possible warning, a red marker that told pilots to change course immediately unless they wanted to die in the most horrible way imaginable. The navigation officer brought the signal to his captain. a massive Valorni warrior named Vorith who had served in the Union fleet for 60 years and had seen more combat than most species experienced in 10 generations. Captain Vorith stared at the blinking light on his display screen and felt his scales tighten against his body in a way they only did when he sensed danger. He knew the SRIV. Every Valoni knew that cursed world. 200 years ago, his people had sent their finest warriors to claim that planet. 500 soldiers in full battle armor, carrying weapons that could destroy buildings and shields that could stop plasma bolts. The Vethkai had killed them all in 9 days. Vorith's own great-grandfather had been among the dead, a decorated war hero who had survived a dozen campaigns only to be torn apart by creatures he never even saw coming. Could the signal be fake? Asked his first officer, a younger Valorni who had never faced real danger in his life. The beacon code is authentic, the navigation officer replied. It belongs to a human survey vessel called the Meridian's Hope that went missing 2 months ago. 2 months. Vorith did not believe it. No one survived on Lesser 4 for 2 months. The longest any colonization attempt had lasted was 19 days. And that was with 800 colonists working together with all the resources of an entire civilization behind them. But regulations were clear about distress signals, and Vorith ordered his ship into orbit around the Death World. He launched a surveillance drone, expecting to find wreckage and bones and maybe the automated beacon, still transmitting from the ruins of a destroyed camp. When the images came back to his screen, Vorith felt something he had not experienced in many decades of military service. He felt shock. There was a camp on the surface. Not a ruin, but an active living settlement with walls standing strong and fires burning bright and something moving around inside. That looked very much like a living person. His entire bridge crew gathered around the display and stared in silence at the impossible sight. Zoom in on the life form, Vorith commanded. The image grew larger and clearer, and there was no mistaking what they were seeing. A human. A single human female walking around the camp like she owned it, tending plants in a small garden, and checking the walls and adjusting some kind of electronic equipment. And at the edge of the forest, lurking in the shadows just beyond the ring of fires, Vorith could see shapes that made his blood run cold. The Vethkai were there, hundreds of them, watching the camp with their terrible glowing eyes. But they were not attacking. They were staying far back, pacing at the edge of the light like they were afraid to come any closer. "Prepare a landing shuttle," Vorith ordered, and he was proud that his voice did not shake. "We are going down there immediately." The shuttle touched down at the edge of the clearing just as the twin suns were beginning to set, and Vorith stepped out with his best soldiers behind him, all of them carrying the most powerful weapons the Union could provide. He expected to find a survivor who was half mad with fear, someone who had somehow managed to hide from the predators and was desperate to escape. Instead, he found Lieutenant Mara Vance sitting calmly beside a fire pit, cooking something in a metal container that smelled strange but not unpleasant. When she looked up and saw the rescue team, she smiled like they were old friends who had stopped by for a visit. "You must be the rescue team," she said in a voice that held no fear at all. "I was starting to wonder when someone would find my beacon." Vorith could not find words to respond. He looked around at the camp and tried to understand what he was seeing. The walls were solid and well constructed, made from ship hull plating that had been welded together with obvious skill and care. Fire pits surrounded the clearing in a wide ring, already burning with flames that pushed back the coming darkness. Speakers mounted on tall poles were playing sounds that Vorith had never heard before, rhythmic and complex and somehow disturbing in a way he could not explain. And the human just sat there like everything was completely normal. "How long have you been here?" Vorith finally managed to ask. "About 8 weeks by my count," Mara replied. "The days here are a different length than what I am used to, so it has been hard to keep track." 8 weeks. Vorith's people had lasted 9 days with 500 trained warriors. The Kreth had lasted 17 days with their underground bunkers. The Morvani had lasted 19 days with all their careful planning. This one human had survived for 8 weeks, alone, with nothing but wreckage and her own 2 hands. How is this possible? Vorith demanded, and he could hear the confusion in his own voice. What weapons did you use? What technology? What secret did you discover? Mara stood up and walked toward him, and Vorith found himself stepping backward even though she was less than half his size, and had no claws or fangs or any natural weapons at all. I made myself scarier than they are, she said simply, and she pointed at the fires and walls and speakers around them. They hunt through fear, so I gave them something to fear instead. Fire hurts their eyes and confuses them because nothing on this planet has ever used it. The walls break their line of sight so they cannot intimidate what they cannot see. And the music makes them think there are many creatures here instead of just one. Vorith looked toward the forest and saw the eyes watching from the shadows. Hundreds of apex predators that had slaughtered his ancestors, keeping their distance from the camp like it was surrounded by poison. They are afraid of you, he said, and the words felt impossible even as they left his mouth. Not afraid exactly, Mara corrected him. They are uncertain. They have never encountered anything like me before, and they do not know how dangerous I might be. For predators that rely on understanding their prey, that uncertainty is worse than fear. One of Vorith's soldiers, a young Kreth medic named Silith, had been scanning the human with a diagnostic device, and her voice trembled when she reported her findings. She is healthy, Silith announced. Minor malnutrition and elevated stress hormones, but nothing serious. She is actually in better physical condition than most survivors we rescue from hostile environments. Vorith did not know what to say or think or feel. He had come to this world expecting tragedy, expecting to collect a body, or at best rescue someone broken and traumatized beyond repair. Instead, he had found a human who had accomplished something that 3 galactic civilizations had failed to do. She had not merely survived. She had established dominance over a world that dominated everything else. Vorith looked at her again, this small, soft creature with no armor and no weapons, and nothing that should have kept her alive for even a single night, and he felt something shift inside him. He was not unsettled by the predators watching from the forest. He was unsettled by the predator standing right in front of him, because that was what she was. That was what all humans were. They looked harmless and weak, but they had never been prey. Somewhere in their evolutionary history, they had become something that made apex predators hesitate. And Vorith understood in that moment that the galaxy had badly underestimated humanity. We should depart before full darkness, one of his soldiers suggested nervously. Mara shrugged her small shoulders. You can leave if you want, but I was going to have dinner first, she said. Would you like to join me? Vorith stared at her for a long moment. This impossible human, who had just invited rescue soldiers to share a meal on the deadliest planet in known space. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He laughed. Yes, he said. I believe I would. The official report on the Vesser 4 incident was classified at the highest possible level, locked behind encryption codes that only a handful of admirals and diplomats in the entire Galactic Union could access. The implications of what had happened on that death world were too significant to release, without careful consideration of what it might mean for the balance of power among the stars. But secrets have a way of escaping no matter how tightly they are held. Within a month, the story had leaked, spreading from station to station and ship to ship like a fire burning through dry grass. Passed along in whispered conversations and private messages and late night discussions in bars where spacers gathered to share tailies. By the end of the standard year, every intelligent species in known space had heard, some version of the story about the human who had survived the unsurvivable world. The details changed with each retelling, growing larger and more dramatic, as stories always do. Some versions claimed she had killed 100 HFY with nothing but a knife and her bare hands. Some versions said she had tamed the creatures and trained them to serve her like pets. Some versions insisted she had lived not 8 weeks, but 8 months on that terrible planet, building an entire city in the valley where her ship had crashed. None of these exaggerated tales were true, but the real story was impressive enough on its own. One human, completely alone, had survived on a world that had killed thousands of colonists from 3 different galactic civilizations. And she had done it not with superior weapons or advanced technology, but with fire and noise and the stubborn refusal to accept that she was supposed to die. The major species of the galaxy began to revise their understanding of humanity. For centuries, they had viewed humans as minor participants in galactic affairs, a young race that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. Clever enough to be useful, but not powerful enough to be important in the great games of interstellar politics. Now they looked at humanity with new eyes. The Valorni Military Academy added an entire section to their training materials about human psychology and survival tactics, teaching young warriors to respect the species that could accomplish what Valorni soldiers could not. The Kreth Diplomatic Corps dispatched researchers to Earth to study human history and culture, trying to understand how this seemingly weak species had conquered their home world and spread to every corner of their solar system before anyone else even noticed they existed. The surviving elders of the Marvani, who had lost so many of their people to the HFY, formally requested an audience with human representatives to ask how humanity had developed such incredible resilience in the face of impossible odds. And everywhere humans traveled in the galaxy, other species looked at them differently than they had before. Not with dismissal or condescension anymore, with something closer to respect. And perhaps, in some cases, with something that looked almost like fear. Lieutenant Mara Vance returned to Earth on a transport ship crowded with reporters and diplomats and scientists who all wanted to interview her. And she answered their questions as honestly as she could, even though she did not really understand why everyone was making such an enormous fuss about what she had done. She kept telling them she had not accomplished anything special. She had just done what humans had always done when they faced danger and death. She had refused to give up. When the transport finally landed on the green and blue world where her species had been born, Mara stepped onto soil that smelled like home and felt tears running down her face that she could not explain or control. She was offered medals and promotions and positions of honor in a dozen different organizations, but she turned them all down. Instead, she accepted a teaching position at the Exoplanetary Survival Academy, a small school that trained people to stay alive in hostile environments. And she spent her days sharing what she had learned with students who might someday find themselves alone on worlds that wanted to kill them. Most of her students were human, young men and women who wanted to explore the dangerous places where no one else dared to go. But some of her students came from other species, Valorni and Kreth and others who had heard the stories and wanted to understand how humans thought about survival. She taught them about fire and how to create it and how to use it as both weapon and tool. She taught them about the psychology of predators and how to turn their hunting instincts against them. She taught them about the importance of refusing to accept death, about the voice inside that said you are not prey and meant every word. One day, a familiar face appeared at her office door. It was Silith, the young Kreth medic who had scanned her on the day of the rescue, and she had traveled all the way from her home world to ask Mara a single question. "When you were out there," Silith asked in a voice soft with curiosity, "alone and surrounded by creatures that had evolved to kill everything they encountered, what did you actually feel?" Mara thought about the question for a long time before she answered. She remembered the terror of those first nights, the cold fear that had gripped her heart as she listened to claws scraping against metal. She remembered the exhaustion that had made her bones ache, the endless work of building and gathering and watching. She remembered the loneliness that had pressed down on her like a weight, the knowledge that she might never see another human face again. But there was something else beneath all of those feelings, something she had never talked about in any of her interviews. Honestly, she finally said, "I felt like I was remembering what we used to be." Silith tilted her head in confusion, and Mara looked out the window at the city that sprawled beyond the academy walls. The towers reaching toward the sky, and the vehicles moving through the streets, and the millions of people living their lives in comfort and safety. Humans spent 200,000 years making things afraid of the dark, Mara explained in a quiet voice. Long before we had cities or writing or science, we had fire and we had each other. And we made the night safe by filling it with light and noise and the promise of violence against anything that threatened us. She turned back to face the young Kreth. The galaxy looked at us building starships and trading goods and living peacefully. And they thought that was all we were, she continued. They forgot that everything we have accomplished comes from those 200,000 years of refusing to be prey. They forgot that we are not a peaceful species who learn to be dangerous. We are a dangerous species who learn to be peaceful. Silith was quiet for a moment, processing this new understanding. Do you think other species could learn to be like humans? She asked. Mara smiled warmly. I think every species that survives long enough to reach the stars has something inside them that refuses to surrender, she replied. We all just express it in different ways. After Silith left, Mara sat alone in her office and thought about the world she had left behind. She had received reports that Desert 4 had become a legend among spacers, a story they told to impress each other and frighten newcomers. Pilots went out of their way to pass by the planet just so they could say they had seen the death world where one human had survived. And there was one detail in those reports that made her smile every single time she thought about it. The Vethkai still avoided her camp. The fires had gone cold many months ago, and the music had stopped playing, and there was nothing left but empty walls and abandoned equipment. But the apex predators of Desert 4 would not enter that clearing. They circled it from a distance, pacing back and forth at the edge where the forest met the open ground, watching the empty space like they expected something to emerge from it at any moment. They did not understand why they avoided it. Their conscious minds could not explain the instinct that kept them away. They only knew that once something had stood in that place that was not prey. Something that had controlled fire and made sounds that broke their understanding. Something that had looked at them without freezing, without running, without the fear that everything else in their world had always shown. And some lessons once learned are never forgotten. Not even by apex predators who had ruled their world for 50 million years. Mara Vance lived out the rest of her days on Earth, teaching and writing and helping prepare the next generation for whatever challenges they might face among the stars. When she finally passed away at the age of 94, she was remembered as a hero by billions of people across dozens of worlds. But she had never thought of herself that way. She was just human. And humans did not accept death quietly. They never had. They never would. That was the truth the galaxy had finally learned. That was the lesson written in fire and blood on a world called Desert 4. And somewhere out there in the darkness between the stars, the creatures of 1,000 worlds looked up at the night sky and felt something their ancestors had never known. They felt the presence of humanity spreading outward like ripples on a dark pond. And they understood at last that the night was no longer empty. Something was out there among the stars that knew how to make fire. Something that refused to be prey. Something that was just getting started.